Today, I thought we'd do something a little different. I'm going to take you through the process of designing and building a web application, and this app that we're designing is going to be part of the PWPT certification, and of course, I'll do my best to avoid spoilers along the way. The process of building a production-ready application is actually quite a long one with a lot of different steps, so I think we'll split this video up into different parts. So to begin with, the ideas, the system design, the wireframes, and the project management, and then in a later video we'll look at the development, testing, and deployment. As cyber threats grow, so does the need for skilled professionals. TCM security certifications are here to elevate your skills to meet these challenges. Our courses are tailored to give you an edge with practical scenario-based exams. Step into the world of advanced cybersecurity at certifications.tcm-sec.com and make your mark. Before we dive in, I just want to say that I have generally two approaches to building CTFs and labs. And the first one is that if I want to demonstrate a specific vulnerability, I'll consider the functionality where that vulnerability might arise, and then also look at reports of real-world applications where it's been found, and then use that as my starting point. But in this case, because I'm going to be building an application that can have multiple vulnerabilities, and of course there will be variations in the vulnerabilities to avoid cheating on the exam, I'm going to actually focus on the web application first, and then consider what vulnerabilities fit into it later on during the development steps. I hope this gives you some insight into how we can design and build realistic web applications that also serve as capture the flags, and honestly, if you've never built a CTF before, then it's a really rewarding experience, so I highly encourage you to give it a try. As always, if you enjoy the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's dive in. So first up, let's run through everything that I like to do to make sure that I have everything in order before I start building the application, and take a look at each of the steps in a little bit more detail after we've run through them. I like to start with general ideas and requirements for the project to help me understand what I need to deliver and also what some of the constraints might be. Next up is the theme, and generally it's important to pick an idea that can fill the scope of the general idea of the project and not be too offbeat or overwhelming. And then after that, we can work on the actual requirements and features of the application. And this is a bit of a milestone because after I've done this, I can start making concrete decisions about my application. Following that, we want to create the wireframes for the application. And I like to do this before I do the in-depth system design, as generally speaking, I want to make sure the application makes sense from a user perspective. And of course, we might make tweaks to our wireframes later on, but it helps me really solidify the idea and the story behind the application. And then next up, we have the system design and also the architecture. So this really gets into the detail of the application, how it's going to work, what endpoints we're going to use, what the architecture looks like, and things like this. And then after that, we can solidify our tech stack decisions. So based on everything that we've thought about and gone through, we can choose the right technology for the job. I'd probably also consider at this point technology that I'm familiar with and technology that I might have to pick up and use, and also factor in the length of the project and how much time I have as well. So sometimes choosing a technology that you're familiar with is better than choosing the optimal technology, at least for smaller projects like this that don't necessarily have to be production ready for millions of users. And finally, after that, I can create a roadmap. I like to use Kanban boards. So generally, I create a long list of tasks with priorities and then set up a Kanban board, and then the development work can begin. So all in all, there are really two main deliverables from this process. First being a design document that I can follow to make sure that when I'm building the web application, I don't make lots and lots of changes on the fly and end up with a mess of an application. And the second is the Kanban board or to-do list of things that I need to get done so that the application is ready for testing and deployment on time. Some of the other benefits of this process include identifying the right technology to use for each part of the application, considering things like models and objects within the application so that we don't need to keep revisiting and updating these during the development process. And finally, we probably also have a good understanding of the the theme and the flow of the application from a user perspective. And once again, since we're trying to build something realistic, I think this is a really important step of the CTF creation process, at least in this case it is. All right, let's take a closer look at each of these steps in more detail, and I'll show you what the outcome will look like. So the first major step is the requirements, and some of these will be project oriented, so like, hey, I've got a month to build this application, and some of them will be requirements like, hey, it needs to be able to support 100 users, for example, or it needs to be using a particular technology. So we put down everything that we know in terms of requirements and constraints and functionality that we know that our application has to have to begin with. And again, if you're going to, for example, submit your CTF to TryHackMe or another platform, then there'll be requirements around that as well. So for example, TryHackMe, if you're using Ubuntu, there are only certain versions you can use, and so again, you need to capture that in this early stage. So exam requirements are things that I'm thinking about, the size and the scope of the exam, so how big the application is going to be to cover a number of days of testing, and also maybe some key features that I think are going to be really, really important. So even at this early stage, I might say, hey, my application needs authentication, it needs authorization, and it needs some other things like different user levels, for example, so users and moderators, or users and admins, or non-subscribers and free users and subscribers and users and things like this. So whatever ideas you have so far that are concrete or unlikely to change, get them down in this document, and don't let it spiral too much out of control, because again, we have some time constraints with our project too. So next up, we have to choose a theme, and most of the time I just kind of pick things that I think would be interesting to make or offer something that, you know, might be fun to test. But of course, we do have to consider the scope and the size of the application. And so thinking about the constraints and what's out of scope, for example, might change the theme that we choose. So if I was to build a weather app, where am I going to get my weather data from? And if I needed to use third-party APIs to make the application realistic or work, in this case, I might not choose that idea because, again, the third-party APIs is on my out of scope list, because people in the exam platform might then accidentally start attacking that third party, and obviously we don't want that. So some of the ideas that I usually go for are parodies. So things like a parody on Formula One, I'm thinking of doing Race One, or a parody on a delivery service, so Planet Express from Futurama, for example. Or we could do a dojo, so previously I built a Cobra Kai dojo CTF, and we could do something like a restaurant and things like that. And of course, some of you might be familiar with the Pasta Mentor as well. And so general applications like shops and job sites and productivity apps and social media platforms and streaming sites are all good themes to work with, because they have a sufficient amount of complexity so that the testing is going to be interesting. And then on top of that, we can use a theme to kind of tie everything together to make the application more realistic. And this might not be important for some people. Maybe some people just want to focus on the vulnerabilities, but when we're building an application, having a theme and something to tie everything together is going to make it a lot more realistic, and also help us build something that is coherent, rather than just throwing together random bits of functionality and then coming up with vulnerabilities that are not necessarily realistic given the situation. So I think the theme is an important part of the overall package. So for this one, I think I'm going to go with the Formula One parody, Race One, and then what I'm going to do is create some wireframes so that I can really understand what might be included from a high-level functionality perspective, and also what is the user experience going to look like, and how am I going to deliver that as part of an application. Once again, trying to make the application as realistic as possible. So next up, we have the wireframes, and you might be wondering why I'm doing this before I actually design the system and the architecture. Well, to be honest, I like to use wireframes to solidify ideas and also think about the functionality and the user story, and really kind of glue everything together before I go in and finalize what my system is going to look like and how I'm going to implement it. And of course, the wireframes might change, but at this point, I think it's good to get them down on paper and then make a final decision whether I want to go ahead or not with this plan. It also helps me understand what the front end is going to look like and how it's going to behave, so I can also make decisions on the front end. So am I going to use a component-based system like React, or am I going to do it all with templates using something like EJS, for example? example, and doing the wireframes is really going to help me decide all of those things and process that information. So now we've come to a big part of the process, and that is putting together the system design, deciding on the architecture, and of course finally deciding what tech stack we're going to use. So let's take a look at the system design first and have a think about what functionality we want to lock into the project and how it's going to work. Alright, so let's take a look at some of the system design, and what I'm going to do is just break down some of the key features. So for example, the live timing in this app is going to be unique to the application. It's not going to be something that's provided by a framework and is a key part of the app itself. So let's take a look at that. And there are quite a few things to consider. So first up, what objects are we going to be using for the live timing? And the first one, I think the driver is important. So the driver is probably going to have an ID, and they're going to have a name and maybe their date of birth, bio, and maybe they're going to have the team and probably a car ID as well. So we also need a car object. So this is probably going to have an ID. And if we're using MongoDB, maybe we can just use the IDs that are automatically generated, but we're not thinking about that in too much detail at the moment. We need the team. So again, this is probably like a team ID, so there's going to be a team object with information about the team, and then we're going to have maybe some background info or like a bio for the car as well. And this might include like the manufacturer, who built the engine, who the sponsors are, things like this. I don't think we need to go into too much detail and add all of that information, but these are things that we probably need to think about. What information do we need to store and what do we need to use? We might even, for example, consider having an array of facts about each driver or facts about each car, so that during the live timing we can have the announcements randomly pop up with different facts or information. So for example, when one driver overtakes another, the announcement can be, hey, so-and-so takes position 6, and an interesting fact about that. So that's a way that we can generate the announcement information and make the application a little bit more interesting. We might not implement all of this, but it's good to get everything down on paper. Otherwise, we'll implement a small part of the live timing and then realize we have to go back and re-engineer all of the objects and add more things and update all of the endpoints, etc., etc. And then I think we're going to have a live object, which is going to, of course, have an ID. And I think this is going to be the driver ID and also the car ID as well. And the reason I want to do this is because I don't really want to store the position and time and what wheel they've got and the fastest lap and everything else in either the car object or the driver object. I kind of want to have a live object as well. This might not be the best or correct way to do it, but in my mind, I think it's going to be a little bit easier to work with later on. So for example, they're going to have what wheel they're on, so soft, medium, hard tire, maybe their current position, although maybe we can just calculate this based on the timing. Not sure, we'll decide later on. And then we want to record their fastest lap, for example. And then from that, we can calculate who has the extra point for the fastest lap. Let's do a status as well. So this could be like, for example, in the pit, on the outlap, in the barrier, if you're Lance Stroll. Don't sue me, Mr. Stroll. And I think that should do now. What about the endpoints we need for this? So how are we going to update this information? I think there's two main ways to do this. We could have an endpoint that when the user calls it, it updates the database and then sends it back. But this isn't very scalable because if we have multiple users, the data is going to get updated way too quick. So I'm not keen on relying on event-driven or user events for this. What I think we will do is we will have some middleware that updates the stats every second, let's say. Maybe we'll change this when we actually implement the system, say, hey, actually every 5 seconds is fine, every 10 seconds, every half a second. And then I think we need a data endpoint or a get updates endpoint. We might call this something different. And what will happen is the user will call this, with a GET request, for example, and it returns the live data as JSON in an array as an object, however we want to do it, but it returns live data. I think this makes logical sense. We have all of our objects here, and then the middleware is going to update the live object. It's probably going to read information from here and here. So it's going to be like, hey, okay, I can get all this information. And obviously it's going to read information from here, and then it's going to process that information and then create, again, it's going to update all of the live objects. And this is a little bit more scalable, I think, because for example, if we wanted to add something like to help the middleware, so for example, if we wanted to add a secret thing called strength of the driver, and let's say we rated all of our drivers from 1 to 10 in strength, the middleware might be able to take this number, for example, and then weigh the position or the times based on this strength. And so it will still be using random numbers to generate the timing data, but that data will then be a little bit more weighted in terms of who's going to be the fastest, who's going to be the slowest. And there'll be smaller changes, I think, between the positions as well. So maybe in 1 minute, you might see second and third swap, but you probably over that minute wouldn't see the second place swap with 20th place, for example. And then of course, we can use this to decide whether there's going to be crashes or whether we actually want to implement the complexity of things like a safety car and figure out all of the timings for that as the group bunch up. So this can obviously quickly spiral out of control into a very complex piece of functionality. But I think so far, if we just get our objects in like this, and then we have the middleware update every second, and then we can retrieve that data from the front end and then process that in the front end. So the front end is going to be responsible for displaying it. I think we're all good. I think this is the best way to implement this. And then from this, we can decide, okay, do we just want to use front-end JavaScript to keep calling the data endpoints? And we also probably need to think about authentication authorization. So I think on the current Formula One website, only subscribers can see the live timing. So we did briefly think about whether we're going to have like free users and then subscriber users on our application. So we might want to think about the constraints and the authorization around this as well. When I'm designing and building any application, regardless of whether it's a captured flag, even if I don't decide everything, I like to sit and go through all of the key pieces of functionality, because as you can quickly see, if I'd started building this and I hadn't thought about a bunch of things like how my objects are going to be laid out, how this middleware is going to work, who's able to access these endpoints, and it can quickly become very complex. My code is going to be really messy, and then of course it's going to be impossible to maintain, scale, or even make a nice application that functions efficiently. So now that everything is kind of down on paper, at least in a rough format, but my ideas are more solid, I can start creating my design documentation. And again, I'll probably put everything from what I've done into a couple of documents. So I'll have a main design document, and then I'll have a system design document, and the key functionality, so the things that really need some thoughts. So in this case, probably the authentication authorization and probably the live timing. Those are the things that I'm going to go deeper into and design them so that they're robust. But everything else, so things like the blog posts and stuff like that and the templates, I'm probably not going to go into detail onto how I'm going to build them, because they're relatively straightforward pieces of functionality. Now, once I've done this and everything is kind of in a place where I want it to be, I can decide what technology stack I'm going to use. And probably through my design process, when I'm making decisions on how I'm going to break things down, how I want my objects to look, how I want to store things, what endpoints I want, this is probably leaning me more towards a particular technology than another. So in this case, I'm probably going to use Node and Express for the backend, because I'm going to be using a lot of API endpoints. And for the front end, I really have to decide, do I want to commit to React and build all of the components, even though I'm not that confident building a React front end? Or could I use something like EJS templates, which I'm pretty confident using because I use these templates quite a lot, use them with Bootstrap, and then use front-end JavaScript to make the API calls. So kind of mimicking that components piece. So this is something that I need to think about, and probably what I'll continue to do is finish designing the application, go through all of the endpoints, step through, decide what I want to include, and then make a final decision decision at the end, but I think it's a toss-up between these two. The other thing I need to consider is what database I want to use to run the system. So in my case, I'm leaning more towards MongoDB because I might have things like the live timing use data that is a little bit more flexible. And I think for applications that don't have a really clear structure, maybe non-relational databases are a little bit better. But if I wanted to spend more time designing the application so that it was very specific, then I would probably go with Postgres or MySQL. So I think in this case, I'm probably going to run with Mongo. I might change my mind later on, but because I want my database to be a little bit more flexible and I want to be able to store things like complex data. So for example, when I'm storing lap times, I might just want to store an array of lap times rather than just having singular ones. And then in a MySQL DB, I'm going to have to normalize that and then have a lap times table and then connect all the IDs together. And I don't really want to have to do that. And I think MongoDB is a little bit easier just to throw data at it and then figure out what to do with it later on. So that's going to give me some nice flexibility, considering that what I want to build is somewhat complex and I'm not sure the exact inner workings of how we're going to do the live timings yet. Another big decision is how we're going to do authentication authorization, and I think we'll probably lean towards using JSON Web Tokens because they're pretty flexible, and our user objects, and since we're considering having admins as well, are again also a little bit flexible too, so we'll be able to adapt the claims or what's inside the JSON Web Token depending on how the system turns out, and if we make any changes during development we can easily update our token. So I think JSON Web Tokens in this case is the best way to go, and if we decide for example to split out the admin functionality onto a subdomain for example, then we can use that JSON Web Token across the two applications, and I think this is a more scalable and probably more modern way to build this application. So now we've finished all of the documentation, I want to think about the high-level architecture that I'm going to employ, and really the main decision here is where am I putting my database? Am I separating it out from the web server? And what technology am I going to use? So in this case I'm going to use Docker and Docker Compose, but also the admin panel as well. Am I going to include that in the main application or is that going to be separate? So probably, I think this is fairly straightforward, but I think we're just going to go with 3 tiers. So we'll have our client, which makes calls to either the web application or it can make calls to the admin application, and then I think we're just going to have a shared DB in the back end here like this. So this is probably the simplest architecture. All of our endpoints are going to be on here, so get slash, for example, it just returns the template. When you make a call to /login or /register, again it's just going to go here, but we need to decide maybe the admin panel, do we put this on a subdomain or do we just keep it as a completely separate application? Maybe these can be the same application, and actually this is just going to be like the /admin endpoints, but I think having the client and the app server and then the DB separate is probably pretty standard for this application. I think from an architecture point of view, because we're not going with something like microservices and we don't have third-party APIs, and we're not using, for example, different sets of databases, and we might include something like a WAF or something like this in front of the application, or maybe 2 different WAFs or reverse proxy here. But again, that doesn't really change the overall architecture of our application. So this is probably what we're going to go with. And then each component, once we've decided whether we're going to separate out the admin panel or not, each component will just be a Docker container. Obviously the client won't be a Docker container, but the application and the database will be separate containers. And then we have a few other things to figure out. So for example, we need to figure out calls and other things because we're using different containers to talk to each other. We'll deal with that when it comes up. And that's it for the system design and architecture and tech stack section. Of course, I still have a little bit of more work to do in terms of updating my documentation and finishing this section, but hopefully it gives you a good idea of the process that I go through to make decisions and move forward with the application. So finally, once all of that is complete and it's in a good place, and I'm not going to show you the final set of documentation because obviously you might get some interesting insights for the exam, and I am intending to build this out into an exam box, but of course there'll be a lot more detail added as I go through each piece of functionality and create each page and template, etc, etc. But what I then do is I dump everything into a Kanban board. So I have 4 columns. I have the to-do column, and then I have the in progress column, and then I have to be tested column, and then I have the complete column. And I think for me, the to be tested column is really, really important. I'm actually terrible at testing my own code and applications. And so going through step by step, thinking about the edge cases and the test cases for each individual piece of functionality, rather than just testing the app as a whole, as a user at the end. So just for example, if we had a multi-step checkout sequence, I'd be like, okay, I can add to basket, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, and then okay, I can do this vulnerability or do this issue that I've added in or that kind of arose as I was building the application, and then I probably wouldn't think about anything else. So having the to test box is also really, really important, and this is just how I work through and develop applications. Of course, there are loads of different ways to keep track of progress and break things down and have tasks and subtasks, but honestly, for this project, it's not a massive development project. There is some complexity to it, but again, it's just me working on it. I don't have to be super organized, and of course I can make decisions on the fly and make changes if I need to. And that's it for this video. So I hope you enjoyed kind of a bit of insight into how we go about designing and building things like capture the flag competitions and also web applications for our exams. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to see the next part where I show you how I develop applications, how I write code, how I troubleshoot that code, what documentation I use, everything else that is required to build an application, then let me know down in the comments below, and I'll catch you next time.